Curt Schilling won World Series rings, became a baseball legend, and then convinced Rhode Island to back his video game dream with $75 million. His studio launched Kingdoms of Amalur, a fantasy role-playing game critics actually liked. Then, within months, the company collapsed. Hundreds of employees were stranded, and taxpayers were left holding the bill. So how did a good game become one of gaming's strangest financial disasters? Curt Schilling was not just a famous athlete looking for a side investment. He was a serious role-playing game obsessive, the kind of player who spent thousands of hours in online worlds and talked about them like they were the future of entertainment. In 2006, he founded 38 Studios, named after the number he wore in baseball. From the start, the plan was not to make one modest game and see what happened. Schilling wanted to build a huge fantasy universe that could support books, merchandise, sequels, and most importantly, a massive online role-playing game meant to compete in the space dominated by World of Warcraft. To make that dream look real, he surrounded it with names that carried weight. Fantasy author R.A. Salvatore was brought in to create the world and its history. Comic artist Todd McFarlane helped shape the visual identity. Veteran game developer Ken Rolston, known for work on The Elder Scrolls, joined the project too. This was the credibility play. Schilling had the passion, the celebrity, and enough money to open the doors. The studio had a world, a vision, and recognizable talent attached to it. But building a massive online fantasy game was not a passion project. It was one of the most expensive bets in the entire industry. So the next question was simple. Where would the money come from? The answer came from Rhode Island. In 2010, the state's Economic Development Corporation approved a $75 million loan guarantee to bring 38 studios from Massachusetts to Rhode Island. The money would be raised through bonds, and the company would use it to relocate, expand, and keep developing its enormous fantasy project. For Rhode Island officials, the pitch was bigger than one studio. The state wanted jobs. It wanted tech credibility. It wanted to become the place where a new video game industry could take root. If 38 studios succeeded, Rhode Island could point to it as proof that the state had attracted a major player in one of the fastest-growing entertainment businesses in the world. But this was not a grant, and it was not free cash from a private investor. It was a public-backed financing deal. If 38 studios could not repay the debt, Rhode Island taxpayers could be left holding the bill. That detail made the bet extraordinary. A small state was tying its economic development ambitions to a company that had celebrity, famous creative names, and a huge vision, but still had not released the massive online game that was supposed to justify everything. So in 2010, 38 studios packed up and moved to Providence. What had started as Curt Schilling's private gaming dream was now connected to public money, public promises, and public risk. To bring in money before the online world was ready, 38 studios needed a release it could sell now. That release became Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning, a single-player fantasy role-playing game built from the universe the company hoped would eventually support its much larger online project. It had bright, colorful art, fast action combat, and a world filled with factions, cities, lore, and quests that hinted at something bigger behind it. The game was not treated like a throwaway side project. It had major names attached to it, including fantasy author R.A. Salvatore on the world, artist Todd McFarlane on the visual style, and Ken Rolston, a lead designer from the Elder Scrolls series, helping shape the role-playing structure. When Reckoning launched in 2012, the response was stronger than the disaster stories sometimes suggest. Many players liked it. Reviewers generally praised the combat, the scale, and the amount of content. Over time, it developed a loyal fan base that remembered it as an underrated role-playing game rather than a failure. The problem was the math behind the studio. According to reports at the time, 38 studios needed roughly 2 million sales for Reckoning to cover its obligations and keep the company moving. Actual sell-through was closer to 1.3 to 1.4 million copies. For a new fantasy game from a new intellectual property, that was not embarrassing. In a normal situation, it might have been a promising start. For 38 studios, it was not enough. The company had a huge payroll, public debt, and an unfinished online game still consuming money. Reckoning was good enough to prove the studio could make a real game, but not big enough to save the company built around it. That was the paradox. Kingdoms of Amalur was not a flop in the normal sense. For 38 studios, pretty successful still meant disaster. The deeper problem was that Kingdoms of Amalur was never the real end goal. 38 Studios was built around a much bigger dream, a massive online role-playing game, usually known by its codename Project Copernicus. This was supposed to be the company's true flagship, the living fantasy world that players would subscribe to, explore for years, and turn into a long-term business. But building a massive online game is one of the most expensive bets in gaming. It needs hundreds of developers, server infrastructure, constant testing, customer support plans, live content pipelines, and years of development before a single subscription dollar comes in. The studio was not just making a game, it was trying to build the machinery of an online service before that service existed. That created two timelines that could not comfortably exist together. On one timeline, Kingdoms of Amalur had to sell millions of copies almost immediately. immediately. It needed to generate enough cash to pay debts, cover payroll, and buy time. On the other timeline, Project Copernicus still needed more money, more staff, and more months of work before it could launch. Those timelines were moving in opposite directions. Reckoning was being asked to rescue the company now, while the MMO was still pulling resources into the future. That was the fatal mistake. 38 Studios was not only risking everything on one game, it was using one single-player role-playing game to finance the foundation of an MMO empire. Before the company had proven it could survive one release cycle, it was already spending like a future giant. And when Reckoning sold well, but not well enough, there was no runway left. By spring of 2012, the runway was gone. 38 Studios missed a scheduled payment to Rhode Island, the state that had backed its $75 million loan guarantee. The company first delivered a check, then officials learned there was not enough money behind it. For a studio already depending on public confidence, that moment was catastrophic. Behind the scenes, executives were trying to find emergency financing. They looked for new investors, rescue deals, and any source of cash that could keep Project Copernicus alive long enough to reach release. None of it arrived in time. The company could not cover its basic obligations, including payroll. Then the collapse reached the employees. Workers who had moved families to Rhode Island for what had been sold as a major new game studio suddenly learned the company was falling apart. Reports described abrupt communication, confusion, and employees discovering that their jobs were gone with little warning. Some had bought homes. Some had relocated from other states. Some were left dealing not only with unemployment but with unpaid wages and unexpected gaps in health coverage. The studio shut down so fast that the dream of Copernicus never got a public launch. What remained were unfinished assets, angry former employees, and a state government forced to explain how a private video game company had become a public financial disaster. In June of 2012, 38 Studios filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Court filings showed liabilities of more than $150 million, while the company's listed assets were only a fraction of that. The gap made clear that this was not a temporary cash problem. The business had failed completely. Rhode Island was left holding the bag. Taxpayers were on the hook for the bond debt, and the deal became a political scandal almost overnight. Lawsuits followed against executives, financial advisors, and others involved in approving or promoting the loan. Over the years, settlements recovered some money, but not enough to erase the damage or the anger. The public question became brutally simple. How had a small state placed such a massive bet on one unproven company? For Kurt Schilling, 38 Studios was supposed to prove that a superstar athlete could build a gaming empire. Instead, its collapse became a case study in overexpansion, weak oversight, and what happens when public money is used to chase a private dream. Kingdoms of Amalur did not die with 38 Studios. Players kept defending it, and years later it returned as a remaster. Proof that the game had value even when the business behind it collapsed. The lesson is harsher. Talent and vision could not survive bad math. Thanks for watching. Comment below. Was this ambition, Schilling's ego, political irresponsibility, or all three?